Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Spotlight series. We're talking about the New Zealand-UK FTA, Free Trade Agreement. Why is New Zealand interested in this? Well, in a difficult world with a lot of trade tension, very limited negotiating powers, problems around the United States and China, all sorts of other issues around COVID, there's all sorts of reasons why we should be interested in such a free trade agreement. But in some ways, this is a rather unusual one, because quite frequently, free trade agreements are between two countries that have done some trade together, but are only now getting involved in quite detailed integration of their economies. And this one's different. There's a bit of history here. So, in terms of foreign countries, New Zealand had a longer trading relationship with Britain than anywhere else, arguably, apart from Australia, by a long, long way. And of course, there's some very specific history in all of this as well, which is New Zealand's economy on the sheep's back through World War II, through the Korean War, until wool prices started to fall, and in the early 1970s, Britain started to negotiate to go into the European Economic Community. And for those of you who can remember that, that was a watershed time for New Zealand, with a huge amount of concern and worry, where New Zealand Prime Ministers went off to Britain to negotiate, and where in the end we got a sort of a deal which was better than in some respects we might have thought, particularly because up till that point most of New Zealand's exports went right around the world to Britain. And most of those were primary product originated processed foods of some sort or another. And we ended up with a number of particular quota deals that since then have been notified through the WTO, and they relate to the old-fashioned New Zealand exports of sheep meats, beef, butter and cheese. And more on that in a minute. But it's also a bit different in the sense that normally there's a negotiation between two partners. And in this one, there's a third player in the bed, if you like, and that's the European Union. And of course, we have been in negotiation with an FTA with the European Union for a couple of years. But that's a different sort of thing, because there were 28 countries involved. There's now 27, because of course the Brexit, the way that Britain has now moved out of the European Union as of the end of last year, but is still in a customs union until the end of this year, and beyond that we just don't know where that goes. That is all very relevant to New Zealand's negotiation on the UK FTA, and I'll tell you particularly why in a moment as well. In a situation like this, normally advanced economies getting together don't necessarily see a lot of gains to be had in terms of things like GDP, and indeed the modelling, the economic modelling on New Zealand and the UK says that there might be $100 million or something like that of advantage in there, but that in terms of extra trade is not major. The amount of trade between the two countries totaling exports and imports is about $6 billion, and as such it's significant and could grow, but we wouldn't expect it to grow hugely, like for example Chinese trade's been growing hugely over the last little while. But it is a chance to do a new generation type arrangement, and that means issues around environment and IP and labour and indigenous rights and gender and issues like that, and I think we'll hear some things about that from Susy. It's also a chance to do some significant reforms in your economy, and certainly New Zealand has used that as trade negotiations as an excuse to liberalise domestically, and there's some signs that Britain would like to do the same as well. We're looking at this from the point of view of Britain. They're in a very unusual position. It's quite hard in recent history to find an example where a country has left an integrated trading arrangement of the sort that the EU is and struck out on its own. But there's clearly both economic and political issues around this, and Boris Johnson no doubt has in mind his hero Winston Churchill as he fights them on the beaches and on the borders and all the rest of it in this. But one reason why we're engaged in negotiation from the British side is they would like and need to have trade agreements around the world, because without those, by the end of this year, they're in a quite disadvantaged trading situation where they will face basic MFN tariffs in many countries that they trade to. And they have to be able to show that they can make progress. And New Zealand is considered quite a sympathetic country for them to make progress against or with. When you look at what they say their aims are, they talk about New Zealand in terms of being highest on the ease of doing business scale around the world, a country where it is possible to do these deals with, but on the other hand, where there's not necessarily going to be very big advantages. Britain is looking for more sales of motor vehicles, more sales of other plant and equipment. For those of you who had the opportunity to drive Morris's or Austins or Vauxhalls, you won't be holding out too long for that new opportunity again. And actually, where a lot of British involvement in New Zealand is, it's not so much in the trade of merchandise goods, it's on services. Britain is the 5th biggest investor in New Zealand, far bigger than China, for example, and a lot of that comes down to things like insurance, travel, and other business services, and I think that's where they would really see some advantages. But when it comes down to it, they'd very much like to throw off their constraints from Europe, the Brussels ties, the ways that the French have held them back in various other negotiations. But when it comes down to it, we are their 53rd most important trading partner. And that immediately says, well, high symbolic value for them, but probably not a lot of very high economic value in all of that. Where are we in all of this? Well, they're our 6th most important trading partner. Now, that's nothing compared to what it used to be, and it's nothing compared to China or Australia or some of the other important trading relationships. But it's nevertheless not insignificant. It's still mainly processed primary products. And this is where we get to a difficult situation, because a lot of New Zealand trade into the EU and into Britain now is still governed by the quota rights or variations of the quota rights that we were granted back in the 70s and then notified to WTO in the 90s. And in particular, there's 5 tariff quota areas on beef, on sheep meats, meaning lamb, on butter, on soft cheese, and on hard cheese. And New Zealand is very concerned that these should not be eroded in terms of these negotiations. But of course it's complicated, because some of those quota rights are they were originally all with Britain, or almost all with Britain. Britain went into the EU, they got shared around, and now there's a question about how they get divided up. Theresa May's been on record as saying that Brexit will not be allowed to disadvantage New Zealand trading into Britain. However, making that a reality is proving quite a difficult issue. The EU and Britain have jointly got together and made an offer to New Zealand, and a similar offer, although much less important, to a number of other partners like Australia, Canada and the United States that don't have FTAs but do have some quota access. And that offer is, we will look at how you have traded over the last 3 years, average it out for the product areas and split it accordingly, pro rata, between British access and EU access. On the face of it, that might sound statistically fair, but actually it's a problem, because over the years, particularly on the dairy product side, the prices have moved around a lot between Britain and EU, and so have exports moved around a lot between Britain and EU. And we've had that flexibility to do that. We won't have that flexibility in future. We will be limited to 2 reduced fixed amounts, and that's potentially disadvantageous to us. And that's something that we'll have to look at negotiating as we go through this. But it's not all old primary produce, it's also new primary produce that could potentially stand to gain. So things like wine, which sometimes more than doubles in price as a result of excise duties getting into Britain. Honey, some seafoods, some fruit. We are certainly looking to get a reduction in tariffs in terms of getting New Zealand product into the market. There's a number of other issues that are important in all of this, and some of them relate to COVID, some of them relate to New Zealand's value added, some of them relate to this very difficult trading tensions that are around internationally at the moment, but I'll leave those at the moment. Thank you.
So thank you. So I've chosen to speak on something quite specific, but I suspect dear to all of us, where I think that the UK trade agreement could provide a unique forum for discussion. So Alan Bollard mentioned briefly intellectual property there, and that is my chosen focus, and specifically the importance of a COVID-19 vaccine and treatment, which, as we all know, the world is collectively waiting for, not only to solve some of our health problems, but the economic problems which are intertwined. So we know that the vaccines and treatments, and I'm going to focus on vaccines, although I will mention treatment along the way, are challenging to invent, not least of all for the biochemists among you because of the 28 different protein structures that the virus seems to have, which masks its behaviour in different areas. But much of the delay once a vaccine is invented are likely to be caused by behaviour that trade agreements either support through patents and related regulatory measures for health and safety, or alternatively that trade agreements have not yet managed to fully tackle with global supply chain issues. So to cover all of this in detail is going to take a considerable amount of time, and I don't have all that time, so I'm going to highlight some main points about what I'm going to suggest that we should negotiate with the UK and how it might address some of these issues. And in fact, that does also affect EU negotiations. So to get to exactly what we should negotiate, I'm going to give you some background to 3 points of what exists in trade agreements, and we can see this particularly in the EU agreements around technology transfer, regulatory data and licensing arrangements. So some of you may have never thought all that much about patents, except they feature in the news more than ever lately. So briefly, patents give exclusive rights and effectively prevent competition for a limited period of time. That's at least 20 years or a bit more, and they're fundamentally justified on what is called innovation incentives. So broadly, a patent is a legal device that is there for an innovation incentive. So patents actually also require mechanisms in it for technology transfer. Now, free trade agreements and the existing relationships we have tend to focus on the innovation incentives side of the equation, not least because Big Pharma is extremely good worldwide, is saying they need more patents and more regulatory data exclusivity for innovation, whatever that means. But in fact, all our trade agreements focus on the innovation incentives, but don't actually focus on how patents enable technology transfer, or in reality in the pharmaceutical area often inhibit it one way or another. So technology transfer is not a concept missing from our trade agreements. It's mentioned, for example, in the TRIPS WTO agreement, but it is neither defined or explicitly spelt out. In fact, that's true across all free trade agreements. One notable exception is that China-US Phase 1 deal actually starts to try and define technology transfer, but not really for this type of purpose, and we might come back to that if there's some Q&A about it. Trade agreements, I put to you, actually, in fact, have adopted what has increasingly been shown as a faulty assumption that once pharmaceuticals are created and patented, they will be made available. The problems of availability and access to medicines are being shined on in sharp relief in the COVID situation, and the pessimist in me says this is likely to get worse, but he is hoping for how it might get better. So there's no certainty that once a vaccine or indeed an effective treatment is invented that it will be fairly licensed for global use. The World Health Organization in New Zealand has joined the effort to say it should be, but there's no certainty that would occur. And in addition, there are problems around supply actually of ingredients. So vaccines and medicines broadly can be biological or chemical, particularly in the chemical thing, there's issues around ingredients, the same is true of biologics, but they're very different ingredient and supply chain issues. All right, now part of the technology transfer problem is this global supply chain. So manufacturing capacity for active ingredients in pharmaceuticals has in fact, by the EU and the UK as part of it, been progressively offshored in the same way we've seen a lot of manufacturing being progressively offshored. But we seem to be in a time, and this is clearly not just the UK and the EU, but that's our focus today, where we're entering what we might describe as pharmaceutical nationalism, where many countries, including the UK, are looking at supplying their own country first, and indeed onshoring active ingredient supply. So making a whole lot of chemicals, biologics that previously the ingredients were offshore, but putting them into a pharmaceutical was onshore. So supply chain issues aren't actually confined to the pharmaceuticals themselves, but also exists for things like the supply of silica sand, which is vital to making the glass vials that come with vaccines. And so if and when a vaccine is invented, there's considerable trade difficulties in getting it out to the waiting world. Now, we know that there are several researchers and companies investigating vaccines and treatments, and many of you will have seen this in the media, but I'm going to focus on the two UK companies, and one in particular that appears, or the UK partnerships that appear to be leading this race. So, many of you, I hope, have heard that Oxford University and AstraZeneca claim to be at a very good stage in clinical trials and having a lot of success around their vaccine. Now, this is a public-private partnership, although in reality it's really a private-private partnership, and essentially in patent terms, and therefore in trade agreement terms, the ownership of the intellectual property is entirely with those entities. They've indicated that they will allow some licensing, however there's exactly no transparency yet about whether that will be voluntary licensing, selective licensing, and allowing suggests that it won't at all be compulsory licensing. Okay. Imperial College also claims to be developing a vaccine, although the Economist has actually pitted it as further behind Oxford. I have no idea how true this is or otherwise, but Imperial College have actually said that they will undergo a social contract kind of licensing. Now, briefly, what that really means is that they will license anyone who is able to do so and gets funding from anywhere. However, their terms actually aren't transparent either. Both of these arrangements considerably rely on the inventors actually patenting and having the property rights to enter into this licensing. Another thing they have in common is the lack of transparency, but this isn't actually entirely surprising because this is actually how the whole pharmaceutical industry works in general. They don't generally announce any licensing terms until they're in a position to actually license something. Now, this is only part of the problem, but it's pretty significant. It also can cause us to question the need for patent-type incentives at all in this kind of pandemic situation. Where the world is really waiting for the vaccine, for the medicine, there's a considerable amount of what disciplines other than mine would call first mover advantage. Right, frequently in pharmaceuticals, first mover advantage is useful, right? You come up with the drug first, that's good. But you don't actually necessarily always know the size and scale of your market. Actually, for the pandemic, you've got a pretty good idea. And so first mover advantage has a lot more efficacy actually over a patenting strategy that might be business as usual. Of course, they may go together. Now, when you have that first mover advantage, there's a question arising as to whether you control all licensing arrangements or you just have voluntary licensing and how much of your information you share. So we've seen commentary about sharing information and patented information and knowledge, but of course we've also seen an equal amount of commentary about sharing being the antithesis of innovation incentives. And it is in fact the pharmaceutical companies who stated that to the World Health Organization, and countries including New Zealand said, we want to share and pool information and indeed medicines. The pharmaceutical companies, not only from the United States, immediately said, no, we don't think so. Now there are one or two exceptions to that, the agreement to pool in the EU and so on. However, history can actually tell us a little bit about how states behave, even because it's not just, of course, the pharmaceutical companies. The states are very reliant on this. And there are some case studies done by some of my colleagues in Australia around this. And the one that I will briefly present to you relates to, you remember bird flu and SARS-1, right? Okay, so the main treatment that was developed around that was oseltamivir. You may know it as Tamiflu. Oseltamivir is the generic chemical name. Tamiflu is the brand name that Roche gave it. So actually, there's a lesson in there, right? Who knows it more by Tamiflu than by its chemical name? Okay, so what does this tell us? Well, in fact, some of you might recall that what actually happened around the world was stockpiling of Tamiflu, which ultimately ended up actually being not very effective as an antiviral. Okay, now, at that particular point, there was what I guess is really a network externality problem, and the question was how best to tackle that problem. So countries actually had a choice, which was the path to self-interest stockpiling, or they had a choice to send the supply to the countries most likely to need it because of the highest risk, right? It's a virus. Countries with high risk will give it to us all, right? We've seen this. This is, you know, we are living through this more than ever. Now, of course, sadly, what did happen was countries stockpiled in self-interest, and this study actually shows you that the countries with the highest stockpile had the lowest amount of risk and the lowest number of cases, whereas Southeast Asia, where there was the highest risk, had the lowest amount of Tamiflu available and couldn't afford it anyway. There was also some tightening up of Roche, and Roche manufactured it. In fact, a Nobel Prize-winning researcher managed to demonstrate that Roche's method was not the most effective method, but the whole drug as a whole ended up actually being not all that effective, and one commentator has said that aspirin was almost as effective. Okay, now this, I'm not suggesting, and nor have the commentators who've really outlined this case study, that this will happen again, right? But it does tell you something about state behaviour and the interest that we are seeing that I've also called pharmaceutical nationalism. Okay. Another important part of this puzzle is actually data secrecy, which stands in opposition to open science and the vaccine provided as a public good. So around the world, there are stories of regulators and companies working together to fast-track vaccine clinical trials and tests and so on. But independent review of these processes is enormously important because quite often they don't necessarily work, right? And this is where data sharing becomes actually enormously important because very clever people can actually make better things by sharing data sooner rather than later. The patent system usually tolerates a bit of delay in that because of the calculus that says overall it's a social good. So the IP system is on trial, and the free trade agreement with the UK should actually provide an opportunity to negotiate into a trade agreement access for New Zealand to the medicine. So we hear periodically that there are various discussions going on. So if one looks at FTA's business as usual, and Alan's outlined in a number of ways why this is not business as usual, but one can actually see that FTAs do a number of things around patents for medicines. So one of those things is to increase data exclusivity. That means keeping it to the regulator and to the patent owner. New Zealand should not agree to any increases in data exclusivity. That's something we suspended in the CPTPP. It's something that's in the EU negotiations, more extensive data exclusivity. We should not increase the expansive nature of patent protection in other ways, but I'll leave that aside. We should not subject Farm Act to even more scrutiny, which does frequently come up in trade agreements. In addition, in the negotiations with the UK, we should actually not only seek to reduce these things if we can, but it might actually be that we need to negotiate the COVID exception. Now, in the event of the failure of the UK, so let's assume that these UK companies actually do invent a vaccine, right? They've admitted that it's going to be pretty hard to manufacture enough to supply everyone quickly. In the event of the failure of the UK to promptly be able to supply New Zealand with a vaccine or a treatment, can we have a voluntary licence? Can we say, well, we'll manufacture it here. Can you licence us the technology? That's technology transfer. We should negotiate this into the trade deal. If not, can we have a compulsory licence, which basically means you take one for a national emergency? Now, given that this is a pandemic, it's an international emergency. Should we be able to manufacture under those circumstances? Now, as the 53rd trading interest, and I found that really interesting, I'm going to suggest why not? Because we're actually very low risk. This is something we actually want from the UK. Many countries wouldn't get this kind of licensing arrangement because it's too risky for the patent owners. Now, regarding COVID treatment and vaccines, overall we shouldn't agree to anything in regulatory procedures, that's health and safety procedures, that prevents information sharing. So in order to overcome existing provisions which do actually prevent this kind of clinical dialogue information sharing, and these provisions come out of trade agreements, which is why I'm focusing, we should in fact have another COVID-style exception to overcome those existing agreements, and that might be information sharing exclusively with the UK, the EU and anyone else they're prepared to share with. So for COVID, this to me seems extremely important. It provides a unique opportunity to actually challenge what is a pre-existing access to medicines problem, but it really is a different kind of problem in the pandemic. And you might ask yourself, isn't this important anyway, in spite of COVID? And I'd agree, yes it is, but if there's ever a time to actually talk about what encouraging innovation incentives in patent law means in a global economy, and what it means for the global supply chain of vaccines and medicines, this is the time, and we should spend a lot of time focusing on that, because with all respect to the very important agriculture and cheese makers of the nation, we've heard from the previous speaker, it's not going to do that much for us. Whereas getting quick access to UK innovation technology will. Now, I don't suggest it's easy, but let's try and negotiate it. And I've drafted the clauses if anyone wants them. Thank you.
I've got a few slides to just share with you. I want to narrow things a little bit and talk about maybe implications for exporters. But before I get to that, I just want to take stock of where we are in terms of the actual exchanges and the extent of the exchanges that we have with the UK at the moment. So obviously my ultimate goal is to be able to talk about specifics, to get to sort of the what now for New Zealand exporters. But I'll do that at the very end. I've got maybe 3-4 slides that talk about it, that paint a picture of where we are today, and then I'll see if I can extend or open up a sort of a dialogue in that space. So I pulled this out of World Trade Organization 2018 report with 2017 data. I've decided to bring this out just so we recognize the fact that most of our conversations these days around trade are in this space, and I think Alan brought that up earlier on as well, and for various reasons, and in most cases for good reasons. But I want to draw your attention to the fact that the UK is still a very major trading economy in the grand scheme of things. Yes, right, the numbers favor this side of the screen, the numbers do favor, the bigger circle there, but the UK is still in its own right a very, very significant trading nation. And that's kind of where we want to see if we can do more or better with the free trade agreement. Now, how does the UK rank versus compared to our other major trading partners? So I got this out of Statistics New Zealand. Do take note of the fact that it says year ending March 2020. So you might notice a slight discrepancy here. Now is it number sixth biggest trading partner, or is it seventh? Here it comes in as 7 simply because I've got the first quarter of 2020 included in there and dropped the first quarter of 2019. Okay, so that's the difference between the 6th versus the 7th. But that's just an aside. What I want to draw your attention to is actually this, the exports, right? That's what I care deeply about. At 3.18 billion. So if you sorted that, that would be our 5th most important export destination. That's a bit of a surprise, right? But we never really talk about it. And I know the numbers again. You know, the numbers do favor the bigger markets, right? We've got the 30, 20, billion dollar range there. But this is still a significant trading partner in its own right, even under the current circumstances. Now, what might a free trade agreement do for us? And this is where a lot of the debate is and the modeling that Alan has referred to. And I'll try to bring across some of the numbers and what they show around how things might look like. All right, so if you go on the UK's website, UK government's website, sort of the equivalent of MFET or NZTE, they've done a bit of modeling to varying degrees. There are very few reports there, 2 or 3. Some of them are very, very interesting. And I've just pulled some of the analysis that they've run. They've run what they are calling a long-run analysis, sort of 10, 15 years, kind of 20, 30 type thinking regarding what might happen. So I don't report here what they predict for the UK economy. Obviously, I'm more interested in what they are saying might happen to New Zealand's exports. There are 2 separate scenarios that they've mapped out. Okay, so scenario 1, I think Alan and Susy might want to weigh in on this again, or perhaps later on, regarding what has actually been done specifically here. But scenario 1 is UK goes for substantial tariff liberalization. New Zealand goes with full liberalization and 25% decline in non-tariff measures. And then that will translate approximately to 15% increase in exports in 2030. It's kind of what this says. The second projection, scenario 2, is more positive than that, but it's predicated on the basis that both New Zealand and the UK commit to full liberalization, plus a 50% reduction in non-tariff measures. Projections are that exports will go to as high as 40%, an increase of 40%. Again, this is not short term, right? It's 10, 15 years downstream. So these are the 2 sort of projections that I've looked at that I've said, oh, this is a bit interesting. Now, where will those opportunities come from? I won't spend time on this. I think Alan has talked about this. I think Susy has covered this to varying degrees as well. So we know food and beverage, sort of, right, our bread and butter really will be sort of quite well covered in this, or should be an area where we might see increases. Digital trade and services, and I think Susy covered a number of dimensions associated with digital trade and services, again, when she talked about intellectual property. So these are some of the sectors where we think that growth will come from. Now, so I leave you with a slide here, the very last one. I won't talk too much to it, but I think it alludes to something that Alan mentioned earlier on, that this is very different in that we are sort of re-engaging a market that we've always been involved with, or with a market with whom we have a rich history. So it's not like with other free trade agreements where we've, had a free trade agreement and then have to spend time trying to learn, to understand that market, trying to promote that opportunity that might exist in that market. This is a very, very different. It's a market that we almost know, that we are familiar with. So with that said, I kind of went back to some of the sources that I was mentioning earlier on, some of the trade information that the UK government has on the website. And they've got something that I found to be quite interesting. They know the number, at least to a certain degree, they know the number of firms that actually export to New Zealand, right? And they also know the number of firms that import from New Zealand. They know that they have that information. And I'll bring up the resource here where you can find that information. So for a start, 7,000, and I'll put up the reference here. There are 7,000 UK businesses that export to New Zealand. Okay, and the 375,000 here that you see, $375,714 worth of products that you see, is a division of the 2.63 billion that we do in imports divided by the number of firms. That's what that would give you. Okay, 2.63 billion that I showed you as imports in 2018 divided by that will give you the 375,000. But I'm less interested in that. I'm more interested in these, right? Because these are the exports. The imports that UK businesses make from New Zealand are the exports for us on this end. And you will notice here that it's just 2,000. They said it's about roughly 2,000 businesses that actually buy out of the UK, that buy New Zealand product. And they tend to buy quite a bit of it, 1.5 million, we're averaging that out per business. So if I'm looking at this, I tend to have several thoughts regarding the types of businesses that we may be dealing with in the UK. So maybe if you are importing from the UK, you're most likely dealing with a lot of SMEs, but if you are exporting there, you may be dealing with larger organizations or with larger, powerful distributors. And there are implications to how businesses might want to approach that. So it's sort of the question that I want to leave you with, a couple of questions really. If we are looking at this, especially the second statistic that I have there is this. So if we are to grow, if we are to realize that 15 to 40% growth, what we are really thinking about is what you see in this last graphic here. So can we grow that number from 2,000 to 2,500 or whatever number that helps us create, help us bring the opportunity to fruition? That's one way to think about it. Another way to think about it is, can we increase the average transaction, the size of the average importation from New Zealand by a UK exporter from 1.5 million to however many. So that's kind of, and this is the thinking when I start to put on my sort of trade development, export promotion type hat. This is what I sort of start to think about, and I've just thrown it there sort of as a conversation starter. Thank you.